Uncle Kathy's passing. And he had gone through almost a month of hospitalization, starting off from the 11th of February in Cape Town, where his last public appearance was at Victor Verster. He had taken part annually in the Victor Verster walk, and after that, although he didn't do the walk this time, but after that felt that something wasn't right and got admitted. Spent, I think, a week or so in hospital in Cape Town. I think it was Grootes Care. And then said to Barbara, hey, I want to go back to Joburg. If anything happens here, I want to be in Joburg. I don't want to die in Cape Town. Came back and was at his flat for a while, and then got admitted to Donald Gordon. And it's only at that point in time that the problem was detected and underwent surgery. Surgery, however, wasn't sufficient. And 8 years ago, it was 5 or 4 in the morning, took his last breath. But his death led to the funeral the next day at this very place. And his death, for many of us, was symbolic of his life, because his funeral articulated his perspectives on the issues of the day, but the character of his funeral reflected the kind of South Africa that he had worked towards for most of his life. There's a wonderful description of the funeral by Prof. Janssen at the board there. And he says it's very rare that you will find at the leader of a Black Liberation Organization people from all faiths would be speaking, and from all race groups represented on stage. And for a minute, even if it was for a brief moment, the vision of what South Africa could be was reflected in that funeral. We live in a world, in a country today where the idea of an inclusive society, a truly inclusive society, is fading. It's being opposed in the most atrocious ways. From Trump taking off the names of black pilots or black soldiers, and now wanting to do stuff at different museums, that anything that speaks of diversity is now being eradicated. But it's also reared its head in this country. Suddenly, DEI is now a swear word, even here. So we must not assume that the challenges to this vision of a non-racial society will only be from what happens in the US. It's deeply embedded in our country. But we still have a long way to go. Our idea of inclusiveness sometimes can be very narrow. It includes some and it excludes a whole lot of others. And I think we need that kind of discussion about what non-racialism actually means in the 21st century. We had it in the 1950s, it meant something then. But in the 21st century, in a different world, what exactly does it mean? You also find that we are grappling. How do you do this in a cricket team? What should the quotas be? And you have a Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture who says, here's a post, but only these people can apply, and others can't apply. Now, he might well be right in what he wanted to do, but the way it's done might also be problematic for some. So we're grappling with the nuts and bolts of what non-racialism needs to be in theory and in practice. Which is why we thought that today's remembrance event must start the discussion of the essence and the content of what non-racialism needs to be in South Africa 2025 and beyond. Because that is what Uncle Kathy stood for, is what he lived for. And in his own simplistic way, he says, as time goes on and society's demographics change, we might arrive at a point where racial classification becomes meaningless and disappear, not through some piece of legislation, but through their complete lack of relevance to individual, group, and national identity. I look forward to that day. So that's the unfinished work of non-racialism that we are asking all of the speakers who are coming up here today to, as we reflect on this remembrance event, is to also reflect on the theme. But it's a special privilege to ask a young woman born here, resident in Canada at the moment, to pay her tribute. One of the people, many people that Uncle Kathy accompanied to Robben Island, and who's also had to deal with her own challenges in Canada. But Natalie Levine might just talk a bit more about that. Over to you, Meg.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you to the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation for the opportunity to speak on the 8th anniversary of the passing of our beloved Uncle Kathy. It is an honor for me to be here today to remember him with all of you. His life and legacy are a beacon to us now, especially as we face the rise of white supremacist and ethno-nationalist regimes globally. His ideals that he built with care and patience during his life of non-racialism and democracy, but building community that disrupts the apartheid logic of separation and hierarchy, offers an antidote to the violence and racism of ascendant apartheid logics around the world. I met Uncle Kathy when I was a toddler.
Can I have just a ladies
I met Uncle Kathy when I was a toddler. My mother and I joined him on a trip he led to Robben Island. I don't recall what he told us on that trip, but I do remember how kind he was to me. Though I didn't understand it then, he centered me, the little child, as he directed dignitaries on the tour. He chose to sit beside me on the ferry and chat, and I'm told that he delighted in me running around the corridors of the prison and playing, not quietly, outside in the yard. When my mother frantically tried to settle me down, Uncle Kathy insisted that she allow me free rein. He said then that during his decades of incarceration, he had missed, most of all, the sound of children. This says two key things to me. Firstly, Uncle Kathy centered and cared about the most vulnerable among us. That was his politics. A politics that was bound up with the idea that the emancipation of those most denigrated by inequalities would liberate us all. And secondly, that he was focused on futures, on the next generation, on dedicating his life to the betterment of the lives to come. Uncle Kathy was committed to the cause of liberation everywhere, not just within the imaginary borders of South Africa. He was an internationalist and drew his inspiration from a variety of struggles. He was moved by a visit when he was a young activist to a concentration camp where the Jews of Europe were annihilated, and understood then the interconnectedness of struggles against violence and oppression. His commitment to the freedom for Palestinian political prisoners reminds us of his integration and of the work of activists. There is the broad ideal that we strive for, and within that, we work with an urgent patience in our different sides of struggle to achieve a collective end and a new beginning. As a Black and Jewish teenager about to finish high school in a North America where racism flourishes and racists are emboldened by political leadership, I hold on tight to Uncle Kathy's legacy. Not his nostalgia for the past, but for his vision of the future. We inherited a special gift from Uncle Kathy as he modeled what it meant to build non-racialism, to thoughtfully engage with the conditions in which we find ourselves, and to act to change the world for the better for all. Continue to rest well and empower dear Uncle Kathy, knowing that the next generation has picked up your spear. Thank you.
There was nothing to be nervous about. I want to, we invited all of the political parties in the government of national unity. The first to respond was the Secretary General's office of the ANC, who unfortunately last night sent a message that due to other commitments he wasn't going to be able to make it, but asked Phoebe Potgieter to stand in. We're also happy that the IFP, through Bongi Nkosi Dlamini, had agreed to speak, and Rise Mzansi, through MEC Buyiso Ramakgopa, had also agreed to come. The others, we didn't get the response. I know Shada would have been hounding them for the last 2 weeks, but there wasn't even the decency of a response. But that's fine. We learn. So, can I ask Bongi Nkosi Dlamini, or the IFP's representative, to... Not here yet. No? Okay. Right. Shada will follow up. MEC Ramakgopa, over to you. Thank you always so much for being amongst the first to respond. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Thank you for the invite, and indeed for following up and making sure that we have an opportunity to lend our voice to this all very, very important discussion. To the Kathrada family, to the ED and chairperson members of the board of the Kathrada Foundation, to the Rise Mzansi national leader, Sisongezo Zibi, in his absence, and all the dignitaries and distinguished guests who are present today. Ngiyabingelela, ngiyalidumedisa, salam alaikum, akechipo. It's a pleasure and an honor to gather here with you today to commemorate the life and legacy of a man who dedicated his life to the struggle for justice, equality, freedom, and non-racialism. Today we gather not just to commemorate the life of the late great Uncle Kathy, but to recommit to his vision and to chart a way forward that will ultimately unite, build, and strengthen our nation. Today offers us an opportunity to reflect on one of the most fundamental pillars of our democracy: non-racialism. More than 3 decades after the end of apartheid, South Africa remains a nation that is striving to fully realize this ideal. And while we have made some progress, we are compelled at this moment to ask ourselves, what more must be done? What more can be done to truly achieve this vision and this ideal of non-racialism? Is this even still a goal worth pursuing? To answer this question, we must first acknowledge that non-racialism is not simply the absence of racism. It is the active dismantling of racial barriers, structures, systems, and prejudices in society. It requires, therefore, deliberate efforts in our policy making, in our institutions, and in our society to render the very notion of racial superiority and inferiority meaningless. It demands, as Nelson Mandela reminded us, that we, and I quote, we liberate both the oppressed and the oppressor from the chains of racial division. But the question that we are seized with today is how. And I will attempt to offer some thoughts, Shan, to help perhaps advance the discussion somewhat. And I'll talk to 3 things. The first is that to truly and fully realize the vision of non-racialism, we must seek first to define what it really means to be South African. Or simply put, we must actively seek to become a nation. Now, although this is a term that we often use to describe ourselves, I would argue that the work of nation building is still far from complete. A nation is more than just a group of people located in a similar geography, governed by a constitution. It speaks to a people who are united by common descent, by a shared history, perhaps, shared cultural values, common language, and most importantly, a common vision and joint purpose for our country. Nation building is not a project that ends when a republic is established and a constitution is adopted. It requires a constant and unending commitment to defining and reimagining who we are as a people and what we stand for. Ensuring that all who live in this country, all who call themselves South African, genuinely feel a sense of belonging, a sense of shared purpose, and are equally invested in the future and success of our country. And we know that that is not always the case. Recent events, recent happenings in the international environment, namely the resurgence of extreme right-wing voices in society, have demonstrated just how fragile and how permeable our sense of nationhood is. There are many amongst us, legitimately and others more nefariously, who exploit the cracks in our national identity and are even emboldened enough to invoke our constitution in demanding a return to segregationist practices and ideals. Now, this is an existential threat that challenges not only our sovereignty, but also our deep sense of nationhood and our ability to craft and forge a shared future. So the second thing we must confront, honestly and frankly, and I welcome this platform and opportunity to do so, the second threat that we must confront to the project of non-racialism lies in the fact that millions of South Africans continue to struggle for their basic needs, for economic security, for dignity, for food. Millions of South Africans, urban and rural, remain relegated to the margins of society, remain trapped in unemployment, in poverty. And this is largely due to the failures of governance. The failure to implement and put into practice the ideals and the vision enshrined in our Constitution. And for those who doubt the scale of this inequality in South Africa, consider this, that as of March 2025, the unemployment rate for white South Africans stands at 6.7%. Yet for black South Africans, it soars to 35.8%. And this is sometimes what is missed when we report at a macro level on some of the challenges facing our country. We do not experience South Africa in the same way. Inequality undermines non-racialism in that South Africa remains to this day a country where largely race still determines who thrives, who struggles, and who succeeds, who gets ahead, and who is left behind. This is, of course, compounded by other factors, language, geography, and spatial segregation that continues to exist. But as we know, this is the product of a country that was designed and built around principles of racial segregation. So until we confront this reality head on, we will never truly build a united, non-racial South Africa. To quote Toni Morrison says, "Educating the conqueror is not our business. But if it were to be, the best way to do it is not to explain anything, but to focus on making ourselves strong." the daily failures of this democratically elected government to successfully eradicate poverty and meaningfully transform the lives of millions of South Africans undermines the very foundations of our democracy and drives people into radicalism, into racism, and into extremism. So we must ensure that the quality of education is improved, that we can secure and guarantee dignified employment, and that opportunities for advancement are not mere privileges reserved for some, but are guarantees for all who live in South Africa. And as leaders of society in this room, we must work hard to build and rebuild society's trust in the democratic project. And we must ensure that the virtues and values that are espoused in our Constitution become the lived reality of every single South African. Lastly, as I move to conclude with my third point, to realize the goal of non-racialism, it will require leadership. Leadership that upholds and adheres to the highest standards of service and governance. Leadership that is willing to make the tough choices and stand firm in the face of doubters and naysayers. And most importantly, leadership that is representative of society and can help chart a compelling and bold vision for this country. This must be a vision that, while anchored in a sense of shared history, must not be shackled by it. And while we recall and commemorate the past, we must, as leaders, be bold enough to reimagine and articulate clearly what the future can hold. And then we must get busy, tirelessly working to achieve it. The gains of our democracy were fought for and won through sacrifice, through resistance, and in some instances paid for even with death. It is now up to us, as leaders, as public servants, as those in civil society, in business, in student leadership. It is now up to us, and the responsibility rests on our shoulders to build a South Africa that is stronger, that is fairer, that is more united and more representative of the nation that we are trying to build. I thank you.
All right, we've had the keynote address. We can all go home now. Thanks for this one. Standing in, as I said, for the ANC Secretary General, Fikile Mbalula, is Phoebe Peter, member of the National Executive of the ANC. Phoebe, over to you. And I will make sure that I deliver some book to you, because you've been hinting the entire morning giving books to this one and that one and that to you. Okay.
So it's a public commitment. Okay, good morning everybody. Once again, apologies from the Secretary General of the ANC. There's a meeting of the National Executive Committee and somehow I got commandeered to be here today. Greetings to everybody, the family, members of the Kathrada Foundation, representatives from political parties, and comrades and friends. When I saw what the theme was around non-racialism, what I was thinking of immediately is that last year we were celebrating 70 years of the Women's Charter. And this year it will be 70 years of the Freedom Charter. And one of the important things about those two events, let's start with the Women's Charter, is the fact that the Federation of South African Women brought women together, black women, women in the trade unions, women from the Congress of Democrats, from the churches, from all sorts of different organizations. It was a truly non-racial event, you know, Ray Alexander and Lillian Ngoye and others. And it made me think that one of the strengths of South Africa is that we have this long history of commitment towards South Africans working together.
And so that when we have the conversations about non-racialism, we have a history to draw on. The Freedom Charter, for example, say that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, but it doesn't just talk about that South Africa belongs to all, it also then goes and say that it talks about the land. It talks about the wealth of the country, it talks about houses, security and comfort. It talks about education and culture, it talks about all of those things. And therefore the link, as the previous speaker has said, between our vision of non-racialism and the concrete things that people face, whether it is the unemployment rate, or whether it is access to quality education, or whether it is land, or whether it's any of the other things that comes into the conversation when we talk about non-racialism. The second issue is that we've had 30 years of democracy, and I remember, two recent incidents. There was a news item about the cricket team, I think maybe a year ago, and my son, and my immediate reaction, because I read out the names and I thought, wow, this team is not representative of South Africa. And my son said to me, but Mom, that's racist. So then I sort of like had to take a step back and say, okay, how do I explain this? And I said to him, but does this mean that in Manenberg or Soweto or Phoenix or other places in the country there are no kids that are good in cricket? That's the problem with having a team that doesn't represent the country. Because what you're saying is that there's no talent in all of our communities. And I think that's the issue about that we often, when we engage on matters of non-racialism, we tend to, and racism even, we tend to sort of like want to immediately shut down the debate and say that's racist, you shouldn't be talking about it, and then immediately people sort of step back because they don't want to be accused of being racist. But we have to have these conversations. You know, the conversation about BELA, the Basic Education Laws Act. Is it about the protection of Afrikaans language? And which Afrikaans language speakers? Because it's not all Afrikaans language speakers. Because in fact, the overwhelming majority of Afrikaans speakers are black. So when they say that we want, what is it, our school, ons school vir ons mense, our school for our people, not talking about every Afrikaans speaking South African. So we do need to have those conversations in order to understand what exactly is meant when we say that somebody is racist, or saying that people are being excluded, or that we want our protection for our issues. The third issue is around the global debate that's going on. And it's a very dangerous debate because in a sense it has emboldened right-wing extremism everywhere. It's not just in the US, it's in Europe, it's in South Africa, it's in other countries. And what are they against? You know, that you don't want textbooks where people talk about slavery in America. It's part of your history. How can you say that you don't want to talk about such a huge part of your history if you look at the number of years in which slavery in the US lasted, or the civil rights movement, or gender, the struggle against gender equality. So the question about what's happening in the world is also very relevant for South Africa, because it forces us to then also answer the question, when we talk about a South Africa that belongs to all who live in it, when we talk about a South Africa that is non-racial, that's non-sexist, what does it mean? And I think that Sean at the beginning said that the non-racialism of the 50s should be different from the non-racialism of today. You know, was it the Four Nations theory of the time? But today, there's a whole different conversation. And in fact, it was very interesting, the report of Stats South Africa, that the list of people that define themselves in census as others. And it's not people from other countries. These are South Africans. It's young people that grow up and say that I see myself as South African and there's not a category for me. And therefore I choose the category of other. And often it's young people that make those choices. So we have to have that conversation, in addition to the conversation about exclusion, about economic exclusion, about social exclusion, about the failures of governance to be able to make sure that everybody that goes to a school have quality education. So all of those are part of the conversation that we must have about non-racialism, about both the socioeconomic dimensions, the personal dimensions, the political dimensions, the institutions where we meet each other. I mean, I often go to universities when I pick up my son and look at how people still, sit together in their groups. And it's maybe a small group where people, reach out. And what are the student movements doing about that, to build non-racial student organizations, to have an SRC that represent all students, so that you don't have the kind of things that you see happening at, is it Stellenbosch or was it University of Orange Free State? The kind of humiliation against individuals. But at the same time also for young people to then understand each other. And similarly in sports, and this is why I think school sports is so important, because it provides an opportunity for kids to, play together with people from other schools, from a school in Soweto and a school in Wentworth, a school in Sandton and a school in Orange Farm. To be able to create those opportunities for the next generation to be able to come together. Because the problem is that often we tend to meet each other in the workplace, or we meet each other in a queue at the supermarket. And often we know how those things can go very horribly wrong because of where we come from, and there is not that understanding about, understanding the other point of view, but also challenging our own attitudes, challenging our own points of views, and also challenging our, how we see each other. Because all of these things are deeply rooted in history. So that if the question is, why is it that Alex look like it is? Yes, it is the problem of the failure of the Alex development plan. But in addition to that, Alex have a very long history. Alfred Nzo lived in Alex, and it was a problematic place at the time. So it's rooted in history, and part of understanding where we come from is about history. The reason why people keep on talking about the complexion of our sports team is because black people were not allowed to play sports. They couldn't compete for the national team. That's part of the history where we come from. Investments in school sports, in sports fields, in training were linked to where you live, the Group Areas Act, etc. So the legacy of all that is part of what we have to deal with when we talk about building non-racial teams, when we talk about building non-racial, literature, and so forth. But I think that fundamentally the question is about inclusion. It is about making sure that whether it is the hospital that we go to, the school that we go to, the street that we drive in, the jobs that we apply for and that's being created, that those leave no one behind. And that's one of the challenges which we face today, that we, over the last 12 years, had extremely pedestrian growth. Unemployment, there was a time when unemployment was, I think, cum laude 20%, or Melissa, and we thought it was way, way, way too high. And now today, if we can get down to 20%, it would be, it would be great. So part of the conversations that we need to do is, what are we going to do to get growth back on track? And we need to get the issues of governance right, we need to sort out our ports, we need to sort out our energy. But we also need to give young people the opportunity to understand what the new world of work looks like. What are the opportunities for entrepreneurship? What are the opportunities to do other things besides going out and getting a job from someone else? And it's all of those things that we need to have the conversation about. Let me conclude by talking about, and I think the question that was asked by the previous speaker about that the first task is letting us know, understanding what it means to be South African. And part of the problem of a world where it says that you can't talk about diversity, you shouldn't talk about inclusion, you shouldn't talk about equity, is very anti-South African. Because by the very nature of our country, we have different languages. We now have 12 official languages. You can't, when you talk about a common approach, it has to acknowledge the fact that we've got 12 official languages. And I always say that one of the important things about both the education system as well as our public broadcaster is that they are big institutions that deal with our indigenous languages. And we must defend them, and we must protect them, and we must advance them, because they do deal with all of our South African languages. So that's part of that diversity that we're talking about. But diversity is also about listening to different points of views. It's also about understanding where people come from. It's also about being committed to the fact that even if, what's his name, Kali Kriel, that we actually have to have a conversation and find out, like, what exactly are you guys about? Like, it just, I think that we're all completely flabbergasted by some of the things that they said. And part of dealing with the diversity of South Africa is to understand where people come from. But at the same time, to also say that you need to understand, I think the quote from Toni Morrison, is to be able to say that what is the lived experience of the majority of South Africans. I have a friend that works for an organization that looks at crime and violence, and he often says to me that more women, more men die from unnatural causes, killing each other, than women. And he says we tend to focus on femicide, but the problem is that we've got a violent culture. So in fact, I think double the amount of men die at each other's hands. So the question is that we do need to look at, yes, how do we address gender equality and this victims of gender-based violence, but we must also address the root cause. And this is what the conversation about non-racialism is about, that we need to talk about our attitudes, we need to understand each other's point of views, but we must also understand where we come from and then address the root causes of it. And I think that Uncle Kathy has been, he worked for non-racialism his entire life. And as Comrade Chan said, that his funeral was such an example of what we can be as a nation. And I certainly think that South Africa, that we mustn't allow ourselves to be bullied. We must be committed to our non-racialism. We must be committed to inclusion. We must be committed to diversity, because that's who we are, and we will be losing something very important of who we are if we pretend that we speak the same language or that we have the same history. But what brings us together is that commitment towards our country and unity in diversity, as our constitution says. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Phoebe. Thank you so much for that. I think we will move on without the IFP speaker. Just to say, we did meet with AfriForum last year or year before, I'm not sure when. It was a fascinating 2-hour discussion at Constitutional Hill. They said to us they accept that apartheid was a crime against humanity. But, there's the big but. But they have no responsibility for what their forebears had done. Secondly, South Africa today doesn't have racists. We're a country of a whole lot of cultural groups. And these cultural groups must have their own spaces, and must be able to relate to each other on their own terms. So it's a whole new language. And then lastly is they obviously had no clue of the history of resistance, because when we took them through the Kathrada exhibition, you could see, well, here was the first time that they were understanding what Robben Island was like through the replica cell. So one of the problems is that we actually don't have a common understanding of our past. And that makes it difficult to then even move ahead. And for that, we have ourselves to blame. Our entire, from '94, the missed opportunities to rectify this, because we were focused on other things. But that has now come back to haunt us. So one of the issues I grapple with is Orania. The self-segregation today, and I'm not clear what my own views are. It does make me uncomfortable, but on the other hand, if that's what people choose to do, and they're not impacting on my life in any way, yeah, that's fine. So I think and that's why I'm saying that our understanding and application of non-racialism today can't be as it was in 1955. The world has changed fundamentally. We have a number of civil society speakers here. It's Nasima from the Helen Suzman Foundation. I think this will be the first time, Nasima, that you talk at an AKF platform. So hugely thank you for that. We'll be followed by Nicole from the Campaign for Free Expression. Nicole used to be at the Helen Suzman Foundation, but has now moved on. and then Rosalie will talk from Defend Our Democracy. And Rosalie will be followed by Zakira Vadi, who today is the last day at Defend Our Democracy. Zakira is moving on, where we don't know yet. She's going to check the Sunday Times adverts this Sunday, just checking for all of them. She's looking for a job. So if anybody knows anything there, I know that City Parks is looking for somebody for this area to be looked after, Zakira. So, there's also a city manager's position that's up that you might want to apply for. So I was saying to Nasima that every year we do a visit to the leaders of the 1956 March in August, the Sunday before August 9th. And we've never gone to the gravesite of Helen Suzman. The foundation themselves have not led on that kind of initiative. And I think it's something that we must consider going forward. There are a range of other leaders who led the women's struggle that we need to recognize through this work that we will do in August as well. So, Nasima, welcome to the AKF fold. And once you speak here, this is now a permanent invitation. So you'll be followed by Nicole, then Rosalie and Zakira, and you have 10 minutes. And if you can do it in less, it's also fine. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It is an honor to be here on a professional level as the new ED at HSF and on a personal level, especially to pay tribute to Uncle Kathy, and I'll tell you a little story about why. I was about 6 years old when Kathy was released from prison. He came to his house in Lens on Willow Street across the park, and my entire family was in a frenzy. And I couldn't understand I was 6. I wanted to go to the shops for ice cream, and they told me this couldn't happen because we had to go and see Uncle Kathy. And I was like, Uncle Kathy, I wanted an ice cream. But I remember going there holding my grandmother's hand, and the entire Willow Street Park was packed. Lens was at a standstill with all of the traffic to welcome this man. I was overwhelmed by all of the people, I was overwhelmed by the crowds, but my grandmother was in tears. And she was so hoping that she would get to see him, and she did. And I don't know what was exchanged between the two of them, but they both shed a tear, and they both walked away smiling. So that was my entry into resistance politics, into social activism. And I'm now here after a career of 20 years in public interest law. And that was the first experience. So I'm here to pay tribute to Uncle Kathy and to say you were the start for me and all of the efforts that I've made in this space. So today, as we remember Uncle Kathy, we've got to also talk about looking forward, as AKF has asked us to do. And I had prepared something that has all of the nice words in it. Challenge, courage, honesty, solidarity. We say these things, we throw them out a lot. But there's two things that I think I want to reflect on. And I think there's parallels to be drawn between Helen Suzman and Kathy in this respect. I want to talk about memory, and I want to talk about action. And we cannot lose memory. If we lose memory, if we do not learn, if we do not take forward what we have struggled to achieve to this generation and the generation after, we will be lost. We will no longer know what a South African and a uniquely South African identity is. We come from a particular place, and we need to go to a particular place. We cannot go to where we are going if we forget where we come from. So memory is important. And when we talk about the initiatives that AKF are talking about, I think they are critically important. And memory is also about resistance. It's about challenge. It's about inspiration. And that leads us to the second point. It leads us to action. And from a civil society point of view and from an HSF point of view, non-racialism for us can become overwhelming. It's this big problem that we know we need to solve, but how? Where do we start? Where do we go? Who do we talk to? And I suppose we've had to drill down, like every other civil society organization that has funding constraints, and to look at the spaces where we can have purposeful impact. And so the way we look to combat this big bad thing of racism and to get to a space where it's no longer a factor is service delivery, is social justice. Because the majority of South Africans that we speak to, that we deal with on a daily basis, are dealing with xenophobia, are dealing with the fact that they can't get their kids into school, with the fact that they go to a hospital and nobody wants to help them. I cannot use words like, I aim for non-racialism. Doesn't resonate, doesn't work. And so in our little way, in the spaces that we operate, it's about going to everyday South Africans and saying, I see you, I hear you, and I'm going to try and find a solution for you. Whether that's about the Uber driver because he's a Zimbabwean and can't get his driver's license renewed so that he can't feed his family, or it's a student teacher that goes to the registration authority and they say, sorry, you are a foreigner and we just don't want you teaching here anymore. So elements of xenophobia, elements of racism, all of these are interconnected. We are going to be inclusive. The idea is to talk to people that are doing the suffering on a daily basis. There's no shortage of it. And all of us have a role to play. All of us have a different role to play. All of us have a different impact to make. So memory, purposeful action, and I suppose the last thing I'd want to talk about as we reflect is responsibility and obligation. For all of us at civil society, we go to conferences often and we talk to each other often. And we are always complaining because there is no shortage of suffering. But the complaining and finding out the source of the problem is the first thing. Then it's like, I know what this problem is. And it's nice. Yes, government's always doing something wrong, there always will be. But the second step is responsibility and obligation. What am I going to do about it? What is my organization going to do about it? And sometimes that gets lost. And so no matter how small the purposeful action is, it makes a difference. So I suppose those are the three things for today. Memory. Honor Kathy. Honor Helen Suzman. Honor the others. It was no small sacrifice. Think about your responsibility within your individual capacities, your communities, and your organizations. And translate that into purposeful action. None of it is too small. So thank you for the honor of having me to talk today. I appreciate it.
Sorry, thanks. Sorry. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, friends. It's a great honor to have been invited to participate in today's observance, paying tribute to the life of Uncle Kathy and to his legacy. It's a great pleasure to have followed Nasima to the podium, the new head of the Helen Suzman Foundation. But I also wanted to say how much I appreciate the fact that, to some extent by design, but also by circumstance, as we are here looking to deepen and enrich the legacy of non-racialism, which Uncle Kathy so stood for, we are also, in a way, observing one of the other founding values of our democracy, which is that of non-sexism. And it is a great pleasure to be part of a lineup of women speakers, overwhelmingly women speakers today, which is something that happens, I think, too rarely in our public life. And so thank you to the AKF for making that happen. It doesn't go unnoticed. I'm not going to be long, but I did want to just start off with a little story, if I may. I'm wearing this pin that says thankful. It was a pin that was given to me earlier this week by a delegation of women from Ukraine who are here in South Africa looking to create awareness of what is happening in Ukraine, and especially around this phenomenon of Ukrainian children being taken into Russia and the efforts that they are making in order to try and retrieve their children from Russia and the dangers that are being faced. I mentioned this pin and the irony that it says thankful. These women who are facing such enormous injustice and atrocity, looking only to try and secure the world's attention, and thanking the interlocutors, those they're engaging with this gesture of thankfulness, when in fact they are suffering such overwhelming odds. And one might say this idea that they need to pay gratitude is minor. But I recognize this because if we turn our minds back and think of that ridiculous spectacle in the Oval Office recently, where a US president and his deputy castigated the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, for not indicating sufficient gratitude. I thought it was ironic. But this meeting for me was to some extent very personally moving, and I hope you will forgive me for sharing this story. Cynthia was there, and so she's heard it. But the fact is that my great-grandfather lies in a mass grave in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. He was shot in the back of his head by the NKVP, which was the precursor of the KGB. That site, where he is buried, is now known as the Memorial to the Victims of Totalitarianism. It was one of the first bombing sites of Putin when he started striking Ukraine. The fact is, my grandfather wasn't Ukrainian. My great-grandfather wasn't Ukrainian. He was Polish, but he did die and is buried in this mass grave. It meant the destruction of my family. It meant that my grandfather came here 3 generations ago to make his life in South Africa. It means that while I can acknowledge the suffering and the trauma of these women from Ukraine, in some ways I know nothing about their lives, because for 3 generations my family had lived safely in this country. And I know that there is some irony in talking about my family's history of injustice when this audience is made up of so many Black and Indian South Africans who have suffered injustice in this country. But this country provided a safe haven and a refuge for mine. Obviously, the fact that as a white foreigner under apartheid, my grandfather didn't suffer the type of prejudice. In fact, he was able to accumulate the privilege that was reserved for white South Africans. But the safety and security of myself as a white South African, of my family, is best guaranteed in a country that upholds a constitution, that looks to reserve rights and freedoms not on the basis of any national, of any racial or ethnic groups, but because of a honoring and safeguarding of the norms and values underlying our constitution. And I say that because sometimes the construction of non-racialism in South Africa suggests that it requires white South Africans to give up, to forego, and to suffer, when in fact, as is the case with my own family, this country built on, a democratic country built on these values of non-racialism, non-sexism, democracy, is one which best safeguards all our futures, and we need to keep that in mind. So I wanted to start with that. I wanted also to reflect on the fact, which has already been referenced today, that we come together at a time when we see not so many, but unfortunately fairly prominent delegations of South Africans making pilgrimages to the United States, beseeching an administration for help on the basis of what are lies, distortions, exaggerations, and misrepresentations as to what is happening in our country. They are obviously receiving at present fairly friendly audience and reception, and their distortions as to what is happening in our country is being amplified on the global stage. I think we have to be conscious that the disproportionate amount of time and attention that is being spent vilifying South Africa by those in the US administration right now suggests that South Africa is being made to function ideologically as a failed state in a way in which it is not genuinely. Whether because of demographic trends, as Ambassador Rasool, who was expelled, enumerated, or for other reasons, there appears to be a vested interest in holding out a narrative that white minorities face only grave peril and persecution within a multiracial nation state, with South Africa being held out as that exemplar on the international stage. for us in South Africa, having to face this misrepresentation, these lies and distortions, it is very easy to become angry. Angry at the insinuation of a white genocide. Angry at the representation of these so-called 142 race laws and the portrayal that we as a country tolerate greater racial injustice now than we did under apartheid. But here's where it gets difficult. Because while it is nonsense that there is a genocide happening here in this country, or anything in any way resembling it, it is true that South Africans across all walks are dying from crime in numbers that is absolutely intolerable. If it is absolutely untrue, and we heard the numbers, that white South Africans are suffering or facing unjustifiable impediments to supporting themselves and their families economically, it is true that huge numbers of South Africans are facing hunger and homelessness and poverty in a way that is absolutely unacceptable. And so the difficulty for us is, as we push back against this narrative that we are facing, or some in South Africa are facing grave injustice, that they are living intolerable lives, and we have to make it clear that that is entirely untrue, we also cannot walk back from our insistence that there is too much suffering in this country, that too many are facing intolerable injustice. And this is where where I'd like to reference Uncle Kathy expressly. He maintained that non-racialism was a radical solidarity, that at its very soul had required the undoing of structural and interpersonal racism. And this is what he wrote. I would still insist that meeting the modern challenges of poverty, hunger, homelessness, and so on requires an approach that has a non-racial outlook embedded within it. And so I would close by saying we have to be angry at the falsity, at the distortions, at the lies that are being propounded around this precious democracy that is still fragile, that still requires so much work to embed it and entrench it. But we have to be equally angry, and perhaps more angry, about the fact that just this week there were stories about children in Bushbuck Ridge who are taking turns to eat, because the fact that there are so many children in our midst who are going without food. And that has to be the call to action, not this idea that those who have enjoyed so much privilege and continue to enjoy privilege in our democracy are facing any particular persecution. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Any of you sleepy? You best wake up. Now's the time. I can see you getting tired. I can see that. And Nicole, I want to echo your sentiments. When I saw the lineup of speakers for Uncle Kathy, I thought you would be delighted, because that's who he was. I was privileged to meet Uncle Kathy. He was the first person from Robben Island that I had an audience with. Never had an audience with anyone in my life. It was simply awesome. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. And I went there with Uncle Yusuf Kara and Mr. Feldman, and we were part of the South African Council on Sport, the people who did the sports side of the liberation struggle, and who sadly these days are treated as a pariah, for want of a better word. We pretend SACOS never existed. Look for SACOS in history book, please. Please, and tell me where you find it. It was the biggest movement of volunteers ever in the world, before Facebook was a thing. We managed to mobilize thousands and thousands of people. For those of you who don't know, just very quickly, SACOS had 2 Olympic events in South Africa. We even had synchronized swimming. As black folk, we had synchronized swimming and gymnastrada. Yes, but people don't know about us. But that's the platform that gave me entree to Uncle Kathy, because it was from being part of that movement that Uncle Kathy wanted to talk to us specifically about our approach on non-racialism. And for us, non-racialism was not just a slogan, it was a way of life. It still is. And it is something we continue to strive for. But to be honest, in South Africa, we're only going to have non-racialism when we start to see each other as human. When we start to move away from our labels and our ideas. When we stop needing to identify as South African, first and foremost. Because as long as we keep wanting to talk about South African, we're going to constantly find an other, somebody who is not. And so that is, for me, where the struggle for non-racialism starts. Is that when we start to talk about, are you illegal or illegal? Are you male or female? Are you black or white? Are you Muslim or Jew? Are you transgender? Prefer not to say other. As long as we have those labels, we can't claim to be truly non-racial. And so for us to do the work of non-racialism means we have to do the work of the transformative justice that our society needs. We're not talking about a justice, and the easiest example for transformative justice is if I'm hungry and I steal a loaf of bread. Our legal system says I get punished. I'm still hungry. In restorative justice, I give you back the bread I stole from you, but I'm still hungry. In transformative justice, we have to have the conversation about why it is that I'm hungry. And that is what we need to do to actually get non-racialism going. And so my challenge to all of us today is about what are the personal things that you and I do to advance non-racialism. And I want to ask a simple question. How big is your table? Who gets to sit at your table? And then, most importantly, who has a voice at your table? And until we all have a voice at the same table of humanity, non-racialism and the ideals and the values that Uncle Kathy lived and died for will continue to remain elusive. So if all of us, when we leave this place, to start to think about who we have at our table, and think about having a seat at the table for someone like Uncle Kathy, the world will be an infinitely better place. So thank you, Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, for this wonderful opportunity. I didn't talk much about defend democracy, but we defend it anyway. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation for the opportunity to speak on my last day at Defend Our Democracy. So I just want to share a few reflections on Uncle Kathy and some of the experiences with him working prior to Defend Our Democracy at the Kathrada Foundation. And I think it's important, given where the world is going towards, we see a veering towards a very rabid form of fascism and right-wing racism globally. So a few years ago, I went on a road trip with Uncle Kathy, with a colleague of mine, to Bethel. And we were going to see Annette and Philip Brits, and these were the parents of a 13-year-old girl, Michelle, who had gone on a Robben Island tour with Uncle Kathy. And Uncle Kathy had conducted 300 trips to Robben Island. Among them were celebrities, royalty, politicians, but Michelle's trip was the most memorable for him. And this was because she was dying. She had leukemia. It was her wish to go to Robben Island. And a second wish was to see Mandela. And Uncle Kathy, after the trip, phoned Mandela and said, "Can we make a plan? Are you able to meet with Michelle?" And Mandela said that, you know what, let's not put her out of her way. She is ill. I'll fly on a helicopter to Bethel and go and meet this young woman who is so keen to meet me. So years later, we took Uncle Kathy to meet her parents, and Michelle had obviously passed on. Her parents took us to her grave, which she herself had chosen, knowing that she was going to die. And I think that this story is important because it tells us, or it characterizes what non-racialism should be about. And it shows us what happens when non-racialism is at the forefront of a country's agenda at a very personal level. Because I think while we have laws, and at that time this was 1998, that are fundamental to restructuring the system, to transforming our society, there has to be a human element to it. And this was demonstrated by a 13-year-old Afrikaner girl who wanted to meet the first black president of the country, and 2 black national leaders who wanted to meet the 13-year-old Afrikaner girl, and in fact with Mandela going all the way to Bethel to visit her. So today, as we implement new policy changes, whether it's about land or the languages that we use in school, we need to couple this with a strong understanding of the human anxieties, the fears, the expectations, and perhaps even the ideological understandings, the historical understandings from both sides, black and white. And through this, are we able to demonstrate our commitment to a non-racial future through interaction with people on our day-to-day basis. Secondly, when I worked at the Kathrada Foundation, there was something I wasn't very happy about. And this was Uncle Kathy's decision to write at the time a public piece saying why he supported the renaming of the de Klerk Boulevard in Cape Town. And I wasn't very happy with it because it wasn't a popular decision to be taking. And being the communications person, I would need to defend this position of Uncle Kathy's. So Uncle Kathy felt the need to go ahead with this. And a few days ago, and his rationale was really that de Klerk could have been stubborn. He could have been like P.W. Botha. He could have not released them with all of the public pressure that there was. He could have simply decided no. But he did. And in that, there was a contribution to a democratic transition. So a few days ago, I found myself sending a message to the de Klerk Foundation, congratulating them and applauding them for their stance taken against Trump and against the disinformation campaign that Nicole was referring to. And when I joined the Kathrada Foundation, Shane told me I need to read a book called Rules for Radicals. And this was really to say that you can shout down a system, but if you're unable to meet people on their understanding about where they are in their journey, and not on where you are in your journey, then what sort of activism are you really doing? Are you really that radical? And Uncle Kathy was able to demonstrate this. So you understood why at the time, even though it was unpopular, de Klerk couldn't be written out of history. And that there needed to be a point of contact still with the de Klerk Foundation, and perhaps today even with those who we disagree ideologically with. So today we can't write out history, write out certain things from history. We can't write out the Kill the Boer song, for instance. We can't write out the apartheid flag. But can we constantly ask ourselves, are we able to forge a new history? And what will that look like? And in doing so, are we able to engage with people across different ideological lines? No society, I think, is able to achieve a true non-racialism, because ultimately everyone will still have their biases. And perhaps those biases are things that people will die with eventually. But as advocates of non-racialism, are we able to work in a way that constantly tries to bring people towards a more progressive version of themselves? And I think the challenge for what we would define as progressives today in the world is that as people move towards extremes, how do we hold people together on a more centrist position? It's a kind of thread, a progressive thread that we can hold people onto. And doing so will require us to take a very different approach to simply discounting the views of someone because they don't necessarily conform to your level or your thinking of progressiveness. But at the same time, I do believe that the world at the moment requires us to do a little bit more. So Uncle Kathy again was on tour a couple of years ago in the UK, and again agreed without my knowledge as communications officer to a BBC Hard Talk interview. There was no preparation for it, he simply went onto the interview and I got the clip later. And they grilled him about an opinion piece that he had written about the Palestinian struggle. His view was at the time in the piece and on the BBC Hard Talk interview that the Palestinians had the right to resist and they could choose that form of resistance, including armed resistance. And he defended it saying that the South African struggle was very much the same. No one can dictate to a struggling population, those who are against occupation and apartheid, what form of struggle they need to adopt. And today, for me, the Palestinian struggle remains at the heart of the fight against fascism globally. Because ultimately, the Palestinians are fighting against a fascist apartheid regime backed up by the support of the United States, now emboldened by Trump. And what's happening in Gaza at the moment represents the worst of what happens when racism is taken to its full end. So it's commendable that South Africa has taken a stance in going to the ICJ. But today, in defense of that non-racial, or that solidarity and non-racial stance that the South African government has taken, are we able to back up our government so that it's not bullied into withdrawing from the ICJ case? How do we reinforce support for government on this issue? And how do we ensure that as fascism grows across the world, how do we look at better ways of struggle? I'm not advocating for violent struggle, but I am saying that there is a need for mass struggle across the world. We've seen this in some European countries, in the US not as yet, but in South Africa, what do we need to be doing? And Shan, can we outwork AfriForum? I know at the moment I can't because I need to take a bit of a break. But can we outwork AfriForum to ensure that their narratives don't dominate? And can we give thought to Uncle Kathy's call a few years ago when he spoke before the UN and he called for a green peace of anti-racism around the world, so a global anti-racism movement. And finally, the last few months have shown us that democracy is not necessarily synonymous with non-racialism. So I think in South Africa, we harbored this misconception because our democratic transition came on the basis of there being an anti-racist struggle or struggle against apartheid. But we see in the US that a democratic system has brought to the fore an autocrat in some ways, or growing autocrat. And we've seen, given the South African example of state capture, and now in the US, how easily democratic systems can be dismantled, and how anti-racism systems within that democratic system can be dismantled as well. So we need to understand that democracy itself, or the notion of democracy, needs to be re-looked at. In Uncle Kathy's life, and I think Phoebe, you hinted at this when you said that the anti-apartheid struggle in itself was non-racial. So when in 1956 those women appeared at the front of that march, it was a non-racial group. When the Rivonia trialists sat together in the dock, it was a non-racial group. And taking this example, if you look at even some of the Congress movement, the Indian Congress may have been organized on racial lines, but it was for a non-racial ideal. So we must ask ourselves today, are we carrying out our democracy in the same way, our democratic struggles in the same way? There are political parties, and I'm going to be a bit critical here. Maybe there are some political parties that are perhaps too white for black people, or too Zulu for Tsonga people. Or there are political parties that may be mobilizing on the basis of African nationalism, and others who may be mobilizing on the basis of narrow religious or ethnic interest. And oftentimes, our societal organizations tend to follow suit. So if we want democracy to succeed, we need to relook at the very way we carry it out. I think there are concerning figures around the decline of democracy in our country. This basically what is called democratic backsliding. and the numbers of South Africans who increasingly feel that they would rather veer towards an autocratic system if their service delivery rights are ensured. So we need to redefine what's the democracy that we want, how we want it to deliver, and we need to ensure that non-racialism still remains a fundamental part and is synonymous with democracy as it had been in 1994. Lastly, I want to thank the Kathrada Foundation, the Defend Our Democracy movement, the staff, volunteers, board members, the affiliate organizations of Defend Our Democracy for really allowing me to be part of this journey. And I think the anti-corruption work of Defend Our Democracy in some ways has its founding here at this exact point where Uncle Kathy's speech or his letter to Zuma was read out at his funeral. And that really began to show us the importance of mass-based work around tackling state capture and corruption in the country. My final point, a few days ago, I was sitting with a member of the Kathrada Foundation staff at the Cornhill Festival, and the member of staff asked me, am I leaving because I have the privilege of leaving the struggle for a better democracy? And I don't think one can ever leave that. If you look at Uncle Kathy's life, from political prisoner to politician, there's no leaving that, no matter where you find yourself. And I think that perhaps is the challenge to all of us here. How do we continue to embody that activism for social justice wherever we are? Thank you.
Somewhere, somehow, as you were concluding, deep down I was hoping you were saying, now I'm withdrawing my resignation. But it didn't come, which is why I asked you to come and speak, hoping that this site of memory behind us is going to just end the pressure on you. But Zakira has done phenomenal work. You know, I threw her into the deep end at the Kathrada Foundation. And then when Reverend Chikani called us together and said, hey, here's a threat coming. We need to rally people. We said to Zakira, go and do this work. And she built a movement. That kind of work takes its toll. Which is why I didn't really do all that I could to reject the resignation. Because I know that you will come back. Somewhere or the other you will continue this work. Also, congratulations to Irfan. And now you're the education officer at Cornhill now. Yeah, well done, well done. Also, it comes through from the foundation. Our closing address is from our Youth Activism Program Manager, Obakeng Khatche. Now, Obakeng comes across unassuming, but has developed a youth program in 54 sites across Gauteng, and does 101 things that I find out later, trying to catch up on the work that they're doing. Obakeng is trying to ensure that by the time we get to 2029, which is the centenary year of Kathrada's birth, there will be a minimum of 100 of these youth clubs. And I think we might get there well beforehand. But these are really youth clubs that serve as entry points for young people to start dealing with issues in the community, and from there, understanding why it requires them to be aware of politics and civic responsibilities. So it's slow work. Phoebe is like rebuilding youth league branches all over the country. Only thing this time, we don't say to them, this is the party that you vote for. We work across party lines. I sat in the youth council last week, and there were young people from all political persuasions there, which I think is really where we need to be in a lot of our work today. So I also want to welcome our board member, Yerazia. belatedly from my side, you're welcome. And then Zora, thank you as well for your presence here. Obakeng, as you close with your closing address, and thereafter, those of you who will join us will go to the gravesite, and I think the rain would have stopped, so we can do the flower laying of the flowers there, and your own tributes and memories in whatever way you want to do. So on that note, from my side, thank you all, and over to Obakeng.
Good morning, everyone. So like Mr. Bolton said, my name is Ahmed Kathrada, and 3 years ago, I started working here. And as you can imagine, my first day at work was at a gravesite. And when I got here, I was like, yo, they probably tricked me and I'm going to work for City Parks or something because of what's going on here. But that is an important moment because from similar reflections that we got today, I got to appreciate the importance of the work of the foundation and the legacy that we are trying to build. So just to open up with my famous quote that I like taking from Uncle Kathy, it says, "We can only be satisfied and happy when every child wakes up in a warm house, has a good nutritious breakfast, is able to say a loving goodbye to both working parents, goes to school in a safe and reliable transport, is met at school by teachers who are there on time, ready and able to teach." We have these aspirations as the foundation, and I think many more people, but the legacy of apartheid and racial segregation continues to set us back. However, I think ours is a more powerful legacy. The legacy of a 34-year-old Ahmed Kathrada in Robben Island with Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Andrew Mlangeni, billionaire Elias Motsoaledi, Raymond Mhlaba, and Dennis Goldberg. It is the legacy of the women of 1956 and the learners of the 1976 Soweto uprising. A legacy that urges us to act against injustices and racism in particular. So when you leave here today, I think it is important for you to ask yourself the question of, what is your contribution? Well, like I said, 3 years ago, I got to realize my contribution and that it does not end at a gravesite. So what we do at the foundation is a whole lot of things, and we're a really small team. But some of these things, like Mr. Bolton said, is these community-based youth clubs that are in communities that are a reflection of the past of apartheid and racism in this country. Many of them without any kind of services, with lack of water, with no schools in the area, who do not know what they're going to eat the following day when they wake up. And I must stand here and admit that unfortunately it has been very difficult for us to go into other communities of other racial groups. We've been met with resistance, we've been met with people just not seeing the importance of the work that we are doing. And I think we see this a lot when we go into schools and engage in schools, and you kind of see the differences in the different schools of the understanding of the importance of ending racism in this country. Part of the work that we do also is understanding that we cannot work in isolation, so we lead the National Youth Coalition, which has 102 organizations nationwide. History work that we do at the foundation, so you'll see some history books when you come to the foundation on the different people, unsung heroes of the struggle of this country. But an interesting one, including, so we also do essay writing competitions and debates on anti-racism under the anti-racism program. At our youth camps that we have annually, we also talk about the issues of how young people can contribute to the struggle against racism. But a fun and interesting one for me is assemblies that we do every week leading up to Human Rights Day. So we go into different schools, primary and high school, but usually it's primary schools that call us. And this year we reached about 12,000 young people. And when we go into these schools, I think an important lesson for me is that racism and hate is taught. You learn about it from home, in the areas that you are in, and the different people that you engage with. Like someone said earlier, who is at your table and what are they saying to you? Because these young people also see racism as complete nonsense. They will, we make examples around, imagine if you we were told that those who use their left hands to write do not get this and this, and those who use their right hands get this and that. And they're able to say that is completely wrong and unfair. And young people just hate racism, and I can put that to you. But as you go into high schools, you see a difference in mindset. You see young people who do not see the importance of this. You see young people who are like, but I'm not racist, there's nothing that I'm doing, so you get a guy, you know? And you get to learn the importance of us doing work to teach people not to be racist. To teach people, sorry. To teach people not to hate one another based on the color of their skins. And it is important for us to know the importance of working in solidarity in doing this work. So like Mr. Bolton is saying, I'm not going to be long, like Mr. Bolton is saying, we met with AfriForum last year, and I think for me it was a privilege to be in that room, because we always talk about the work that we need to do and everything, but we never talk about conversations that we need to have with those we do not agree with. Conversations to hear their side of the story, although their side of the story is something else, but it's important to understand. And in that meeting, one thing that I think was a highlight for me is how they organize in communities, and you know, the kind of contributions they get is little, so every household contributes something to the work that they do. And I remember walking out of there and saying, you know, if tomorrow something could happen in this country, AfriForum will probably be the most radio kind of organization that can move to anywhere because of the kind of finances and resources and support that they have. And I realized that we talk about wanting to do anti-racism work, youth development and everything else, but we do not organize as effectively for the kind of aspirations that we have. And there is an importance for us to doing this. And I hope what they are doing currently is a wake-up call to many of us to take time to engage anyone from the organization that you know, to read up on them and how they organize, and you will see that we are not doing enough. Organizations might be in their different corners doing different kind of works, but until we meet at one table and say, this is the action that we need to take, it will never be enough. And in closing, still on the same thing, Martin Luther King says, those who love peace must organize as effectively as those who love war. Thank you.
Just thanks, Obake. As part of the remembrance work that we're doing, we will host Mike Barrage tomorrow at Constitutional Hill at, I think it's 1:30. As part of an intergenerational dialogue. Mac, as some of you will know, turns 90 in April, still doing remarkable work, and we hope that all of the young people here and others will take the time there to really engage with him. So on that note, if you will join us, we'll go over.
I need a picture of all the women.
Yeah, but on the issue of the women, you know, what Uncle Kathy would have been doing here today, he would have been looking at the shoes of all of the women. Because, no, and it's true, wherever he went, he would come back and say, man, the percentage of women who are wearing high heels
was so pathetic.
You know, was incredibly high, and he couldn't figure out why they would torture themselves. But he would come with very, you know, with stats on this thing. And he would have done that today, and I'm happy to say that I think it would have been at 0, but that's because of the weather.